Today in the conversation, we look at a most important issue, that of public opinion and voting and polling and so on. Persons have asked, what is it and why is it important? Today, we want to have that discussion and more with the Executive Chairman of Market Research Limited, Mr. Don Anderson, who so happens to also be a senior lecturer, former senior lecturer of research methods at the University of the West Indies. Welcome, Mr. Anderson. How are you?
Thank you very much. Good to be on your program.
Now, polling, voting, public opinion, these things have always seemed, well, first of all, why is it important? And what is it?
It comes out of marketing, and marketing is a common sense science. If you want to market a product, if you want to advertise a product, if you want to, whatever, set up a business, what's important is data. The area of market research and polling, political or otherwise, is where you get the data to inform good decisions. And therefore, it's the means by which you get information to make the best possible decisions. So if you look at the motto of my company, Market Research Services Limited, it is always asking questions, always providing answers. So we're in the business of providing data to assist in the best management decisions, whether it's a political environment or commercial environment. That's the same kind of principle.
Same principles on both. All right. So just before we get into all of those things, though, for the benefit of those who might not know, how long have you been involved in market research and generally, and then voting, polling specifically?
All right. Well, in 1970, I was teaching at Campion College and needed to earn some extra money as an early married graduate. And one of my brothers, now unfortunately deceased, said to me, you know, you can earn some money around by a company called Market Research Jamaica Limited. And I said, well, what is market research? And he told me about this company on Norwood Avenue. I went around there, I got a part-time job in 1970 doing interviewing, walking, pounding the pavements, doing interviewing, asking people questions, using a paper questionnaire. And in 1971, it was an English-based company. And in 1971, the general manager of the company said to me, you've been working here part-time for a couple of months. Would you like to join the company? 1971, January. They were going to be paying me a little bit more than I was earning teaching. And it sounded very attractive, so I joined the company in January 1971 as a research executive. I looked around at the staff and I said, well, I was the only university graduate at that time, because the general manager was an Englishman who had attained, I think, a HND, higher national degree or something. And I figured, well, if I waited my time and sat around, maybe I'd get promoted in this organization. And sure enough, by July 1972, they changed the original manager that I went there and began to work with. And the new manager was a very astute Englishman, not because he sent me overseas for training, but because he had a reason for doing that. He had actually got himself a new job in 1972 and wanted a replacement. So he recommended I go to England to meet the directors, which I did. I went up there as a research executive in June of 1972, and I returned as the general manager of the company, because whilst I was up there, he resigned and recommended that I take over the company. So 18 months into working with this new organization, I was promoted to the general manager. 2 years later, it was 1970s, you know, with Michael Manley, the difficulty of getting funds out of Jamaica. And in 1974, I negotiated with the new principals in the UK to buy the company. That was the origin. This was the time that Market Research Services Limited was set up. And we began operating as Market Research Services Limited from January 1975. That tells you I've been in the market research business for 50 years.
50 years?
Yep.
So tell us now about political polling now, because you're no stranger to that. In fact, you're described as a veteran poller now.
Yes, well, you know, the principles that guide the conduct of market research are no different from the principles that guide the conduct of political polling. Talk about sampling, talking about representativeness, that type of thing. So the principles are the same. So having worked in this organization, you know, got a fair amount of experience working in the UK markets. In the 1980s, when the Honorable Edward Seaga became the Prime Minister in 1980, he asked me to do a number of studies for the Bustamante Institute, which was, again, you know, as you know, a JLP organization, so to speak. And they wanted to know how people were thinking about the things that were happening in the country, etc. So we did a fair number of polls. We didn't even call it polls then. It was just a survey to find out how people were thinking. And he used that information judiciously in the political environment because he wanted to know how were people thinking about the pattern, the trends of political movement in Jamaica. How were people feeling about the JLP administration that was in office, and so on. So we did a little, you know, we never even thought much about it then, some, you know, small surveys leading into the 1980, 85, 86, thereabout. And then on one occasion, I got a call from Jamaica House. Prime Minister Edward Seaga would like to see me. Went up to Jamaica House, dropped everything, never met with a Prime Minister before. And when I got there, he said, you've been doing a fair amount of work for the Bustamante Institute. What's the latest piece of information you have? Pulled out my data, shared it with him, and I'll never forget the words that Mr. Seaga used then. He says, well, it will please you to note that your information is within 1% of what Professor Carlstone has. Would you do some work for the party? I said, well, sure. That's how I got into active political polling on the instigation of Mr. Seaga.
Oh, so he was seeking to balance the power between, well, the fact that Carlstone was already there, Prof. Yes. Stone was already doing that. Could it be said that you started polling for just the JLP, or it was just generally and it so happened to be you that helped them?
No, I started polling for the JLP.
Oh, okay.
I started polling through Mr. Seaga and was invited to begin polling for the JLP, particularly to find out how the government was doing leading up to the 1989 election.
All right. So this other question, the idea about national sampling and how do you design? First, how do you design something that's nationally representative as far as sampling is concerned, and how does that size affect the accuracy of your polls?
Well, let me give you an example, and maybe the example that I use quite often when I'm teaching, right? It's called the bowl of soup example. It is probably the simplest way. I don't know, it's almost lunchtime now. The simplest way to explain sampling, bowl of soup. Now, imagine you have a bowl of vegetable soup in front of you for lunch. You're just about to start having this bowl of vegetable soup. Somebody calls you and says, boy, there's an important telephone call for you. And, you know, of course, you express regret, but you say, okay, let me take this call. 10, 15 minutes later, you come back. And I'm using the example of a bowl of vegetable soup for a good reason. 10 minutes later, you come back and you want to now have your soup. If you do not stir that soup and take up a spoonful of that soup, you're going to get a spoonful of soup that is not representative of how the soup tastes. Why? Some of the ingredients would have settled on the bottom and, you know, that type of thing. So you have ingredients in there. You have corn, and you have some chocha, you have a little piece of carrot, and, you know, all that kind of mixture.
Yeah.
Right? So you're wise and you decide, you know, let me stir up this soup, man, because if I don't do that, I'm not going to get a good mix of how the soup tastes. So you stir that soup up, and I can guarantee you that in that spoonful that you will take up, you will have ingredients in there in the proportions in which they are in the bigger bowl of soup.
I'm following.
All right. So the spoonful of soup is representative of how the soup tastes. I'm going to give you another concept. So in order to really validate how that soup tastes, you're going to have another one and another one, and each of them is stirred to make sure that you have all the ingredients in that spoonful of soup. Okay? Comes a point in time where to have more of that soup doesn't give you any different perception or view of how the soup tastes. You're just filling your stomach at that point in time, satisfying your hunger or whatever. So the more of that soup you have, all you're doing is actually lending credence to how it tastes. It is not different from sampling a population. Once you have a sample of that population in the correct mix in which the people are represented within the population, you can project upwards from the base that you have to the total population and know that within a certain level of accuracy, that is exactly what the population thinks. Similarly, that's how the soup tastes. Because you have mixed it, you've pulled a spoonful, you've had another one, and another one, and you've confirmed this is how the soup tastes. So the representative spoonful is exactly how that soup tastes. The representative sample is what the population thinks. Here's a parallel.
Wow. So why I wanted to find out specifically that, and it's intriguing that you used soup though. I'm looking at the population of the US, for example. It's roughly 330, give or take, million people.
That's correct.
And when they're doing their polls, you might hear them saying about a representative sample of about 1,012. It's always a funny number there, so
yes,
1,000
yes.
plus some
Right.
other. But then when you are doing the same poll here, I'm hearing the same number. Jamaica has a little under 3 million people. So why is it that we would use the same number that they would use? You know, how does that affect the accuracy of the projections, or doesn't it?
Well, the first thing that tells you is that the sample size is not necessarily a reflection of the population of the country. So, again, what is most important in designing a sample is its representativeness. If the sample is representative of the population, you can project up to the total population within a certain margin of error. And we have established that with a 1,000 sample, and we do sometimes, I'm going to tell you when it varies from 1,000, but with a 1,000 sample, we have calculated that that 1,000 sample is within plus or minus 3% of the actual. It's 95% sure that the data you get is within plus or minus 3% of the actual. So that's a statistical calculation, all right? So that, you know, people talk about margin of error.
Yeah.
The politicians like to talk about margin of error. If you get data, for example, which says that one has 28% and one of 24, invariably they say that means we could have 31 or 25 because you're within 3% of what the actual data is saying. So there's always room for error, and there's always a margin of error that we have to factor for. That margin of error is plus or minus 3 percentage points.
Okay, so for those persons who might say abruptly that they have never been polled, one, or they have never met anyone that has ever been polled, how does that, because I'm trying to wrap my mind around that, because if you have done this poll, for example, since this year has started,
Right.
you have conducted more than one poll.
We have done a number of political polls.
You've done a number of political
and we have
polls.
done a number of other surveys outside which use the same kind of sample sizes and differently.
So then, what would you say for those? Because I'm saying that there are persons who can tell me boldly that they themselves have never been polled and they have never met anyone that has ever been polled. And we're just looking at, there's so much to go around and no more. 3 million.
Well, let's put it this way. When you do a 1,000 sample survey in Jamaica, and the United States example is even more demonstrative of the point I'm making. When you do a 1,000 sample survey in Jamaica, it means that 2,899,000 persons were not interviewed. For the moment, facetiously, you happen to be one of them. 2,899,000 people were not interviewed in that survey. So go as far as you want to the United States now, where, as you rightly say, maybe 200 million, 250 million people of voting age, and they do a 1,000 sample. It means 289,000 people, or 289 million people were not interviewed in a survey. The bottom line is, you know, that the most important thing, and I'm going to repeat this, the most important thing in a sample is that it has to be representative. So take the other side of the coin. We could have a sample of 10,000 persons, which would be more, and then you may very well get interviewed in that 10,000 sample.
Oh.
You could have a sample of 10,000 persons. If that sample is not representative of the population of Jamaica, then the data you're presenting cannot be representative and reflective of how Jamaicans think.
All right.
So the larger the sample size doesn't necessarily give you more accurate data.
All right, so with that, we'll go for our first break. We are speaking with Don Anderson. We're speaking with Don Anderson, veteran pollster, executive chairman of the Market Research Services Limited. This is a conversation. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the conversation. As stated before, we are speaking with Dan Anderson, Executive Chairman of the Market Research Services Limited and former senior lecturer at the University of the West Indies. Just before the break, we started looking at representative sampling and stuff. What we wanted to find out, though, can you shed light on some of the scientific methodologies that you might use to gather the data, or some of the techniques that you might find useful?
Yeah. Well, first of all, as I indicated earlier, the techniques that you use in polling is very similar, are similar to the ones that you use in market research, because it's the same approach, making sure you're interviewing the correct persons, and most importantly, at the end of your fieldwork exercise, because we tend to do one-on-one interviews with persons in households, etc. Most important is the validation of the data, because when you have a team of interviewers working on a project, a market research project, for example, they're out on their own to a large extent. Now we have much more control because all our interviews are done on smartphones, so we have a lot more control in terms of where they are and knowing each day what they're doing. But a very important aspect of the quality control is the validation of the data. So what we do, we use a certain percentage of every interviewer's work. We have to go back and randomly call back to persons to make sure the person actually went there, conducted the interview as we expected to. And once we have completed our validation exercise, that's when we process the data. We don't process the data until we complete that validation exercise and are comfortable that the interview was done as we have indicated and as we have specified. So that's a very important quality control mechanism. Of course, monitoring the fieldwork as we go along, because nowadays we can pick up the data. Every day they're uploaded to our data analysis platform, and we can see who is working where, etc. So we can keep control, maintain control of the process, and then we validate prior to doing the analysis of the data.
All right. So when we look at political polling, especially during intense election seasons, we're looking at a whole heap of attention, and you have relentless scrutiny that you're up against. How do you handle the pressure and uphold your integrity and the integrity of your company in terms of your polling work and in such high-stakes situations?
Well, the first and foremost is that the political polling that we do represents no more than about 5 or 6% of our entire business. Now, we say that because it's the loudest. The political polling is the loudest. It's covered in, in the media, in the newspapers, in television, etc. And there is a tendency, for example, when I walk around, people call me the pollster. I'm really first and foremost a market research professional, all right? And in that context, we're doing work for a wide range of international organizations, corporate bodies in Jamaica. I don't want to name them, but just about any industry that you can think of in Jamaica. My company works along with them, international lending agencies, etc. We are the preferred market research supplier for a particularly large international organization throughout the Caribbean. So what do? We know that professionally, we ensure that all the procedures that we have in place are within the standards of and all the ethical practices that we know are required for market research, and we follow it rigidly, absolutely rigidly. But, with all of that, when you do political polls, you're going to get the brickbats, and you're going to get, people throwing darts at you because they don't like the data. The bottom line is our reputation stands us in good stead, because we have done work for both political parties. We have found the parties that we've worked for to be trailing behind by points, and we've found them to be ahead. We've called it for parties that, and the bottom line is the professional approach that we use stands us in good stead, because it really doesn't matter to us who wins from a political polling perspective. We call the data as we see it.
Okay. All right. So we are looking at the current poll now, the most recent poll that was commissioned by the People's National Party, and we're seeing one of the questions that you came up with, or one of the questions that you gave, was if you decided to go out to vote, which of the two main parties would you more inclined to vote for? Could you shed some light on that? Because I'm seeing where PNP now has 30%, and the JLP has 25%.
Right.
One has a reduction, one has an increase.
Right.
And that's within the margin of error.
Within the margin of error.
So is that something that we need to pay much attention to? Firstly?
Yes, well, I think what's important is to give you the trend, because in any kind of survey work you're doing, the trend is the best predictive tool. In other words, if you have a long time series of data and it is trending in a certain direction, it basically informs you as to how the eventual outcome of that investigation could go. To break it down, let me look at 2007 election in Jamaica, and I picked that one for a very good reason. 2007 election, when we started in January looking at how the parties might stack up, because we knew it was an election year. Right? So we started from maybe January. When we started, the People's National Party was in office, had a 9% lead over the Jamaica Labour Party.
Yeah.
It was such an intense year that we were hired by another entity, media entity, to do polls. We did about 9 polls between January and September when elections were held.
And that was CVM polls.
CVM polls.
Yes.
Right? I didn't know if you wanted me to call that, but anyway. So between January and September, we polled about 9 times. And from a situation in January where the PNP was leading by 9 percentage points, we saw that gap narrow with each poll that we did. So we began to say, boy, it's going to be important when the elections are called. Because if it was called in July, maybe, because elections are not won on the basis of polls, maybe the PNP could have won that election. But it wasn't. By July, the gap was even narrower. Early August, it was narrower still. And by the end of August, the lines were almost together. When we did the first poll in September, the lines crossed for the first time. JLP were about 1 percentage point ahead.
But I was still within the margin of error.
Still within the margin of error. But I remember the host on CVM television kept on nudging me from August. You must call it now, man. You must know how it's going to go. Call it. And I said, no, because we're seeing a pattern develop. We're not seeing it changed, but when we did the last poll, the lines crossed. The Saturday before the Monday when the election was held. And on the Sunday, I was able to get on television, on CVM television, and say, based on the trend that we saw, the Jamaica Labour Party, which was in opposition, would win 32 seats, and the People's National Party would win 28 seats. That's exactly how the election came out on the Monday after the votes were counted.
So when I
tells you a number of things.
Yes, because it says a number of things, but I'm looking at the poll, the most recent poll,
yes.
and I'm seeing the PNP with a 2.1% increase and the JLP having a 2.9% decrease.
Okay.
So I'm saying that this is well within the margin of error still, but you're saying that if, based on the findings here, if an election was to be called, it's most likely that the PNP would be ahead. They
would have a good chance of winning, but I make the point that polls don't decide who wins an election. Elections are won on election day. And especially today in the Caribbean where elections have become pretty transactional, you know, the polls will give you a good indication as to what strategy ought to be developed. For example, if we were close to elections now, and who knows, we may be, if we were close to elections now, that data would inform the respective strategies of the two parties. It should, because they would then look at it and say, okay, one would say, boy, we're 5 percentage points behind. We need to develop a strategy which could pull us up in line and get us over the line.
So in line with this, the statement that was made, because a statement was made by a particular member of parliament that the polls were fictitious and contrived and they were aimed at stirring voter confidence. Pretty much you want to upset the apple cart. Are these statements and by well, they're founded now? There any basis for the statements to be made?
I will give you a reference. Again, Mr. Seaga, God bless his memory. When Mr. Seaga was in opposition during the time when the People's National Party were winning the 89 and the 93 and the 97, etc. elections, and the polls that we were doing suggested that the People's National Party would win again, that the Seaga-led JLP wouldn't win. Mr. Seaga was very critical of the polls when they were released. We used to then do a lot of work for the Gleaner, so we were the Gleaner pollster at that point in time. And Mr. Seaga took the same position that the current Jamaica Labour Party administration government is now taking, where they attack the polls. And friends of mine would say, boy, Mr. Seaga on the radio really cussing you out and so on. You're not going to respond to him? And my answer then was, you know, the first person who calls me in the morning, Mr. Seaga, to ask me if I have any more data that he could share with him. All right? In other words, to a lot of them, it's a game. You know, Mr. Seaga knew. And he was the first person who would ask me, called me at home and said, boy, you know, I'm the data out there, but is there any other data you have that you could share with me? Of course, I couldn't do that because the data belonged to the Gleaner, you know. But to speak specifically to this set of...
What I'm trying to find out is saying that Mr. Morgan is pretty much playing the same game that other politicians would have played.
Well, to put it this way, I don't ignore these comments, but since we know that what we do can stand up to scrutiny and any scrutiny, because we're a professional organization that would never, ever risk our reputation as the premier market research company in the Caribbean for any political party. We know. So we don't ignore it, clearly, but we're not overly perturbed by that because we know that they know better, put it that way, you know. And I was very heartened by Mr. Morgan's comments when in February we released the poll that said the People's National Party had moved from a deficit of 13 percentage points to be 0.2 of a percentage point above the Jamaica Labour Party. For the first time, the lines crossed, okay? Just like they crossed in 2007 when I called the election for the Jamaica Labour Party. So I have no problem. When I see the data pointing in a certain direction, I am bold enough to call it as I see it, all right? When that data in February was released, I was very heartened by Mr. Morgan's comments. I heard him saying, well, we can understand why it is like that, and he gave us a certain set of drivers of that kind of data, why the data was looking that way. I said, oh, this is maturity. So when I see him talking what he's talking now, I'm a little bit disappointed, but that's about it.
All right, so we go to our next break. When we come back, we'll be looking at how the two leaders stack up against each other. Is it that one is losing or the other simply gained? Stay tuned, this is The Conversation. Welcome back to The Conversation with veteran pollster Dan Anderson. Just before the break, we wanted to look at the favorability ratings of both leaders, because we understand that sometimes elections are won by the leaders themselves being on the ground doing what needs to be done. And we see the last poll that you had conducted in June, we're seeing Mark Golding now with 53.2% rating and Andrew Holness with 54.5%, still within the margin of error. But what does this mean? What can we take from it?
All right. Let me not use those numbers in particular, because those numbers were a kind of arbitrary combination of the average and the positive. All right? In other words, in all previous polls that we have done, and this was just the same, we had a 5-point scale where we asked people how to rate the respective leaders, how to rate the respective parties. All right? And that 5-point scale was very good, good, average, poor, very poor.
Wouldn't a 3-point poll have been better?
No, the more disaggregated you get it, the more you can get valuable data out of it. All right. So what we did was to add the average with the good and the very good. Simply because when we generated the data in the past, people said, boy, but average means not bad, not good, not bad. And therefore, for comfort, some of the political parties wanted to add the average to the very good and the very good. So just to see how they compared on that basis, we did the same thing for Holness, for Golding, for the PNP, for the JLP. So whatever we did, adding the average to the positive was done for everybody. Okay. However, the correct way to do it is really to look at the disaggregated numbers, to look at the very good and the good, that's positive. Average is middle of the road, it could be either up there or it could be down there. And then the very poor and the poor, very poor. We have that data broken out, even though it wasn't released that way initially. We have that data broken out. So I'm going to tell you what that looks like, because that is probably the more worthwhile level to compare it at.
Yes.
All right? Which you have a copy of. So what it means, and we're comparing the February 23 and the June 23 only, just those 2 periods. And if we look, for example, at the rating of the opposition now, the opposition had a positive rating of 14.4% in February 23, and that rating fell to 10.8%. So there was a fall off of 3.6% for how the People's National Party was rated. Fall off in the of 3.6%, right? But if we look at the poor and the very poor, the negative now, the total negative was 51.7% in February. That fell to 49.4%. So there's a fall off in the negative. So they were better perceived or less badly perceived in the June poll than they were in the February poll. All right. So what it meant was a slight fall off in the perception, in the positive perception of the People's National Party. The positive fell by 3.6 percentage points, and the negative fell by 2.3. So there was a net negative of 1.3 percentage. So they were a little less well perceived. All right. What about the government? The government fell by the same kind of token. All right. Let's look at the opposition leader first of all. Golden had a positive of 14.7%. That fell to 12.1%, so there was a fall off of 2.6%. But the negative fell by more than that, so that Mr. Golden's positive rating was a little bit better, the difference between the net negative and the net positive. All right. Now, you should have Mr. Holness's, which I probably don't have here, but I can tell you that Mr. Golden's ratings were behaved in the same way. So his rating fell, positive rating fell significantly, and his negative rating rose a little bit. So both leaders are not as well perceived as they were in February. Both leaders. The difference is that Mr. Holness's ratings have been consistently better than Mr. Golden's ratings. All right? I want to make a point about leadership and the pull that leadership has in terms of support. During the charismatic years of a P.J. Patterson and a Portia Simpson Miller, where their popularity ratings were like 50, 60%, that type of thing, the country was very leader-centric. Mr. Siaga's ratings were fairly low. And making the point, therefore, that both parties were, certainly the People's National Party, was being driven by the charismatic leadership of a P.J. Patterson and a Portia Simpson Miller. When Mr. Holness took over as leader of the Jamaica Labour Party, he did also attract pretty strong positive ratings for his leadership, right? Very strong. So his ratings, however, have fallen significantly from in the 40s all the way down to the low 20s. Mr. Golden's ratings have never been high, because taken from Peter Phillips, he took over from Peter Phillips, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, thereabout. Peter Phillips' ratings were like mid 15, 16, 17%. Mr. Golden, his ratings were about the same thing. He probably rose to about 18, 19%. But he was never perceived as leader-centric to the extent that a P.J. Patterson or a Portia Simpson Miller were. Right. What we're seeing now is that both leaders, the shine has rubbed off in the last survey of both leaders, and they're not the drivers of the party support now. We're not saying it can't change, but they're not driving the party support at this point in time because their ratings are falling, have fallen.
So,
right?
so as far as you said that it wasn't, it's no longer leader-centric, but could it mean then that it's based on the messaging that these leaders are giving? Is it that they're not communicating properly, or they're not as energetic as they used to be?
Well, let me talk in terms of what we see happening and some actual data from the Electoral Office on voting patterns and so on. Between 2011, that election in 2011 and 2020, the People's National Party lost about 165,000 voters.
And the JLP gained about 4,000 during that time.
No, JLP lost. JLP lost about 4,000 votes. Yes,
Oh, they lost as well.
4,000 votes. So what we saw, in other words, put another way, in the 2020 election, 165,000 persons less voted for the People's National Party than did so in 2011. And that same period, the JLP's fall off was only 4 percentage points, right? So there was a significant turnoff of party supporters of the People's National Party between 2011 and 2020. What we're picking up in polls and other work we've been doing since 2020 is that it appears that some of the people who voted for the People's National Party and fell off by 2020 appears that they are beginning to reconsider the PNP as an option. So picture scale. You put a little bit more weight in one side, it shifts the balance. And that's effectively what is taking place in terms of party support.
So could this signal a healing for the People's National Party?
It's too early to tell. That 160,000 is a lot of persons, you know, a significant number of persons against the background of the fact that they had, you know, a tremendous support in 2011, which gave them a 42-21 majority. We come to 2020, and what are they, 14 seats, 49 seats. So that, to a large extent, is accounted for it. So we've seen a fair amount of pullback, coming back, if you wish, of support for the People's National Party from their hard base, which very many people believe the core support for the People's National Party is probably only marginally better than the core support for the Jamaica Labour Party. So it seems as if some of that support that they lost is coming back, which is tilting the scales a little bit. So the JLP, in terms of percentage share, hasn't lost much, you know, from the peak of 31% in July last year. They're down to 25%. That's a 6 percentage points fall. It's not a huge drop, but it's a tilting of the scale which is taking place apparently.
All right, so you had stated earlier that elections are won on the day based on the machinery
not by what the polls say at all.
Now, how difficult or how easy would it be now for the People's National Party to eke away at the 49 seats that the JLP has in the bag?
Well, a gap of what, 34, 49, 14, that gives you what, 35? Mm-hmm. That's a huge task. But it appears as if the foundation has been laid for some kind of erosion. Now, bottom line is that the polls are just indicative of how people are thinking. No messaging, for example, has been brought to bear on any campaign as far as I know. The People's National Party is still trying to find candidates in many constituencies. We're doing a fair amount of work in that regard.
Well,
hired by them to do a lot of work in the constituencies.
Could it be then that the timing is what's off here? Because a number of things were happening while the polls were being conducted. We just came out of a restructuring program. So all those things that are happening, could it just be a reflection of the period as opposed to something bigger? Well,
there's no question that the fall off in the Jamaica Labour Party support has been a result of a number of factors that we all know about. You know, it's been the old question of the challenges in the salary negotiations with the police and the teachers and the nurses and everybody. A number of different problems, the road traffic situation, which a lot of people felt was very autocratically handed down without consultation. May or may not be so, but that's the perception. Challenges that, you know, the whole question of the financial sector with the kind of SSL issue, which a lot of people from information we have didn't feel was handled well by the government. There are a number of factors that people could point to, and I haven't named all of them, that I believe would have caused the JLP to lose some support. All right?
Oh, so that means then they definitely should be paying attention to the section of your poll that says that 53% of those polled think that JLP is leading the country in the wrong direction.
There's a very easy explanation for that. Yesterday I was happy to be able to explain that to some people. Now, 37.8% of the voting public went and cast their ballot in 2020. 37%. Some of them, not many, for the People's National Party, and the bulk of that 37% for the Jamaica Labour Party. So let us use some rough numbers. Let us say that amounts to 24% of the voting public voted for the Jamaica Labour Party. What it means is that 76% didn't vote for them.
Yeah.
Right? So, when you ask that question, how do you think, what is the direction you feel the country is going in now? You have a pool of 76% who either are totally turned off on the political process, who don't like the JLP and didn't vote for them. And it is that bunch from which that 58% comes. You follow me? So it's very easy to understand. And I'll tell you, there are very few countries where we ask that question. We're doing political polls in about 9 countries in the Caribbean. I cannot recall asking that question where the majority feel the country is going in the right direction, because in none of these countries is the majority voting for the government in office.
Oh, so it's common then for something like this to happen at this point in time.
It's not something to panic about. It is a common thing, because in none of these countries is the majority voting for, even in countries where you have a high voter turnout. In St. Kitts or thereabout, and in Antigua, where we did the poll in January, I think the turnout was maybe about 60-something%. But even in that, the election was split like 49-51. And therefore, that 51% who didn't vote for the government would be the ones who are saying the country is not going in the right direction, plus those who didn't vote. So it's very easy to see that 53% who don't feel. It's not something to be alarmed about. It is consistent with the pattern that we have seen in the rest of the Caribbean, and generally when we do this kind of work.
So, but this speaks to more than ever the idea of voter apathy, because your polls have consistently shown a high number of voter apathy among those. Does that then have anything to do with the messaging that both political parties are put on? No, they're definitely not energetic enough. They can't engage us.
It has a lot to do with negatives that people ascribe to and assign to the respective parties. When we ask, and we just did a presentation for the electoral office, for example, at their retreat, and when we ask that question, we have a pattern over the years. Why are people not coming out to vote? And let me just make the point that 37.8%, yes, COVID year, and people are likely to want to suggest that that's the reason why people didn't turn out. The pattern has been consistently from about 1990, a considerable fall off in the number of people who turned out to vote. So that 37.8% who voted in 2020 was the bottom line in terms of the apathy that we have seen, or the highest point of apathy. And why are people not going out? They don't like politics, they don't like the parties, they don't think the parties are doing anything for them, they don't like, it's a range of inherent negatives that are conditioning people's minds against going out to vote. So even though in 1962, we had a turnout of about 80%, and we had consistently high turnouts. In 1980 election, we had maybe over 80% turnout. I don't remember the numbers exactly now. So from that peak, we have fallen to 37.8% gradually, against the background of the fact that the number of people who are registered to vote is far more than twice times what it was then. So what you can see is a widening of the gap between those who are registered and those who vote. Yeah, a lot of them get the voter ID as an ID, a national ID. But the fact of the matter is that people tell you they don't like the political environment. That's why they're not going out to vote.
All right. So we continue more after this break. You're watching The Conversation with Don Anderson, veteran pollster. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Conversation. Just before the break, we started looking at something that you said stood out. You said that from the 60s up to now, so we have had an increase in the amount of persons that are eligible to vote, but yet still there has been a consistent decline in the number of persons that have actually voted.
Right.
We're coming from the high 80s to now mid-30s, 37%.
Absolutely.
Now, that means that pretty much now we have been independent for a number of decades. It's roughly the same amount of persons that are voting now that voted back then.
Precisely.
What can the political parties do to ensure that they actually get more persons out? What can they do to entice people to actually come out and vote? Not for transactional purposes, but just to vote because it's your national duty.
Okay. So, based on the last election, over 60% of the people who were eligible to vote did not go to vote. Right? There's a hard core of them that I don't think any party is going to be able to get to come out to vote. When you look at the historical pattern since, as we said, from 1962, where you had close to 80% turnout and, you know, going along the line. In 1980, we had about 80% turnout. But again, something that needs to be taken into consideration is that then when elections were called, people registered to go to vote. So that was understandable. I think round about, from the information I got from the electoral office, maybe about 2000, they changed the pattern where there was continuous registration. Now, what continuous registration has done is to encourage people to go out and register, get a card, but they will tell you, the electoral office, that a lot of people get the card for an ID, a national ID. So, but it means that those persons don't really mean to vote anyway. So, what the parties would need to do is to really do a thorough analysis of the reasons why people are not going out to vote, who they are, what is the demographic of the people who aren't going out to vote. And we do have a lot of information on that. But get a good handle on the factors that are inhibiting voters, people from going out to vote, and then the messaging would revolve around that, you know, because knowing what the problem is halfway towards basically designing a solution for it. Once they know why people are not going out to vote, they're going to take a look at that 62% thereabout who didn't vote last time. Who are they? What is their demographic? What age group? Are they males or females, etc.? Are they people in the country or whatever? Get a good profile of the persons who did go to vote. And then find out why they didn't go to vote. So work would need to be done. Surveys would need to be done, canvassing would need to be done to find out why is it that people aren't going out to vote. We have a lot of the answers based on what people have told us. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that people don't think that the political parties are serving their interests to the extent that they would like them to.
Well, so, I'm looking at something that you had. You said, what do you feel is the biggest challenge facing Jamaica? Right. Crime and violence, that's 45%. And then you have cost of living and unemployment, that's roughly another 32%.
Absolutely.
That has looked at that. And then unemployment and all of those other things will account for the other numbers. But one of the things that I wanted to ask, though, earlier, based on the polls that you have conducted, the fact that the political party that's in power now is saying that it's contrived, is it that they're looking at how you actually conducted the poll to say that most of the persons that you have interviewed were probably from particular constituency, or how they poll? What do you think would have been some of the reasons behind some of those statements?
No, the thought is that if you can discredit the polls, the numbers will look better. It's nothing more than that. In other words, they want to make sure that the general public who are reading the data don't get carried away with the poll data and don't say, boy, it looks like we can't win the election. So the way to counteract that is to make the kinds of statements that they've made in order to kind of, you know, ensure that their supporters don't panic and don't drift away. All right? So it's really a way of trying to shore up any potential loss from what the polls are saying. Not that I think they believe what they're saying.
All right. So what are some of the most persistent misconceptions or myths about polling that you might frequently encounter, and how you deal with these misconceptions while creating or enlightening the public about the strengths and limitations of the whole polling system?
Yeah, well, generally, when the poll data suggests that one party is behind, they tend to try to refute it, because if they, as I said, if they can refute it, then this will probably balance the data for themselves. So that's basically the big challenge, is that invariably they do that. But the bottom line is that one just needs to point to the historical evidence. When, for example, in July 2022, we did the poll and we released the poll which had the Jamaica Labour Party 13 percentage points ahead, coming from a situation where they were 8 percentage points in 2021. So the data says that the Jamaica Labour Party improved their position by 5 percentage points. The People's National Party were now trailing by 13 percentage points. I don't think I heard the JLP complaining about that. All right, so there's a certain extent that you don't get into an argument that you don't need to get into. So again, when the data now says that the People's National Party are 5 percentage points ahead, I just remind them that we did data less than a year ago that had your party 13 percentage points ahead. Nothing was wrong with that survey. Why would you want to try to discredit the one that has you behind? And people see through all of that. So you don't get carried away with that. You don't ignore it.
Mm-hmm. But I'm looking at it. So they started the year. Let's assume that they started the year on 31%, and then we see that in February they came down to 27.9, right. And then now they're at 25. Right. While the PNP, they started out at 18, they jumped 10%, right. And they're up to 28, and now they're at 30. So we're looking at this, and we're looking at this.
Right. So you see a gradual, they shot up from 18 in July 2022 to 28 in February 2023. And that was a 10 percentage point jump. The next movement was a 2 percentage point jump. So maybe it is leveling off, maybe. Who knows? All right. You won't know until when you do another survey and you can compare the poll data, the actual voter intention, when the next survey and this one. So remember, I made reference to the 2007 poll, where I did 9 polls between January of 27 and September, and you could see the pattern developing. What's important here is to look at the pattern going forward. This is a snapshot. It is the second snapshot for the year, and obviously it would suit whoever, both parties, to do a survey, a poll in another month or so to find out what's the current situation. Because the trend is really what is going to be the determining factor of the likely outcome of the election. It's not just a snapshot. So if the scenario is, if when we do a poll, say in September, August, September, and the People's National Party moves ahead by 7 percentage points, then I would believe that the Jamaica Labour Party would want to sit up and take a look at it and say, wow, here's work needs to be done. If, when we do the survey in September, the data says that the gap is not 5 percentage points by 3 percentage points, People's National Party would see, what is happening? Why did we fall off by 2 percentage points, or why is the gap closed by 2 percentage points? So there is value for both political parties from this data. They would need to determine, therefore, based on the data that is in front of them, what is our messaging now to our constituents and the people that we want to get to vote for us. Marketing is such a simple science, and politics is the same way. I tell the politicians every time I get a chance, right? I've done that. You think you're into politics, you're not really into politics, you're into marketing. You have a product that you want to get to a certain set of people, you need to find out how, when, where, why, all those kinds of things. And therefore, it's important that you do a kind of evaluation of the market, polls, marketing, same thing. You have a product you want to get to people, you want people to buy it. You need to know what shape they want it in, what color, when do they want it, what price. So all of these are the factors that you have to take into consideration in doing a political poll and looking at poll data to see, okay, I am 5 percentage points behind, I'm 5 percentage points ahead. What do I need to do to consolidate? What do I need to catch up? It's all about that, getting the data to be able to work with it. And then you develop a messaging from that. It's straightforward.
All right. When was the last time, if I'm at liberty to ask, did the Jamaica Labour Party commission a poll through your organization?
I think my memory serves me right, probably about maybe between 2016 and 2020. Not officially, maybe members of the party would have commissioned constituency polls, but in 2016, I did a considerable amount of political work for the Jamaica Labour Party through Mr. Edward Ziago. I did probably as much work for the PNP as I did for the JLP, or put another way, as much work for the JLP as I did for the PNP.
That's 7 years ago.
Yeah.
All right.
But I'm pretty sure, if my memory serves me right, we would have done occasional polls, but nothing of a national nature since then, because they've had their own polls to work for them. That's not an issue.
So do you think that they might have taken that route because they feel somehow that you are less aligned with them and more aligned with the other party, or?
It's not unlikely, but you know, I could categorically say that it doesn't really matter to me. Which, you know, we have a very strong professional stance on what we do. We do, and you know, for example, in some of the criticism, some of the concerns that I heard were expressed, people are saying that because the PNP commissioned the poll that they determine the questions and so on. Absolutely no way. There's no entity that we can work with. We work along with everybody, and we reserve the right to design the questionnaire, to determine how the methodology actually pans out. There's nobody that will work for that will dictate that and determine where you work. It's just, it would be unethical. It would be unethical. It would be not professional. And we would never go that route. So we hear them, but you know, we don't ignore them, as I tell you. But it's not something that we're worried about, because we know we adhere to all the strict professional and ethical standards that govern our research, our market research business.
So you're saying then, what I should understand from what you're saying is that, because quite often the media might present conflicting poll results.
They shouldn't. Well, in what sense? I'm not quite sure.
And they might lead to widespread confusion against amid the general public. Say, for example, the JLP will say that they have their own polling mechanism, and they have found these numbers, and they are starkly contrasting to the ones that you present, and both of those are going into the media. How do you navigate, or how do you deal with these discrepancies?
I think one would need to look at the reputation of the pollsters.
Reputation. All right, unpack that a little bit more. Unpack that a little bit.
Well, you know, we have a very strong professional reputation for doing good work over the last 50 years. We stand on that.
Stand on that?
Yep. We can't speak to anybody else's poll. We can only speak to what we do, and we are confident about what we do. We have a very strong professional reputation to defend, and we guard that very jealously.
Yes. So lastly now, how do you adeptly navigate the intricate ethical considerations then that might arise? Because we know that polls generally have the power to influence. Because right now, what I'm thinking that based on the fact that the JLP is losing, they might actually shore up their supporters based on what's happening, or based on the fact that the JLP or the PNP seems that they're gaining grounds, they might also be shoring up their supporters to do that.
So in other words, do polls influence?
What extent?
You know, if a particular poll says that a party is significantly ahead of another one, what it tends to do, doesn't have to, but what it tends to do is to encourage those who are ahead. It galvanizes support for the one that is seen to be ahead, and it probably serves to weaken the support of those who are behind. It's all a bandwagon effect. You know, so if a party is seen to be so significantly ahead, you will find that it kind of encourages support for those persons who are maybe sitting on the fence, who may be so inclined, but who are maybe sitting on the fence. It encourages them to join the bandwagon. And therefore, if a party is, say, 40% and the other one 29%, you find that poll probably encourages those who hadn't decided before and how they would like to vote to join the crowd of the 40%, and it may very well diminish because some people might say, boy, it don't look like we have a chance to win. Those are the likely impacts of a poll that a significant difference in the popular support. If the polls are marginal, 2-3 percentage point ahead, I don't think it has an impact. It is then dependent on the messaging of the respective parties to shift that balance.
So it's too early to call then?
Absolutely. I mean, no election is scheduled before 2025, but we don't know what the government has in mind.
All right.
Yeah.
So let me take this opportunity to thank you very much,
Pleasure.
Mr. Dan Anderson, for having broken down the information here in digestible bits, and we'll have you again on the conversation.
I'd be happy to be back again anytime we can make it.
All right.
All right.
There you have it, our conversation with veteran pollster Dan Anderson, the Executive Chairman of Market Research Services Limited. I'm Kwame Thomas, and this is The Conversation.